Meghan Markle's shocking humiliation in Geneva finally proves that she has just gone mad.
Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, has finally broken her silence on Meghan Markle. For years, Sophie intentionally stayed out of the public debate surrounding Meghan. But that didn't stop the comparisons between the two women. Meghan's recent appearance in Geneva drew global attention. However, Sophie's arrival days later brought almost none of it, and sparked an entirely different kind of discussion. Now the question isn't what happened in Geneva. It's what Sophie said, and why it's being interpreted so differently by everyone hearing it. What exactly did Sophie say? And is this really about Geneva, or something that started long before it? Join us as we unveil what Sophie said when she decided to break her silence. Same city, 2 days apart. It all came into focus in Geneva on May 17, 2026. Two women were in the same city within 48 hours of each other. One arrived with cameras following her every move. The other arrived with a mandate she didn't need. By the end of the week, the two women couldn't have looked more different, and only one of them seemed to know exactly why. Meghan Markle stepped out at Place des Nations for the inauguration of the Lost Screen Memorial, 50 illuminated light boxes, each showing the phone lock screen of a child who died from online harm. When she took the podium, she told the crowd the memorial behind her represented real children, not statistics, avatars, or data points. She said safe online spaces were not a technology problem, but a public health issue, citing examples such as seatbelts and unsafe medicines to argue that society already knows how to act when harm is preventable. She closed by saying the world must act again. It was the kind of speech that draws a standing ovation and makes headlines. What the coverage did not always note was the institutional scaffolding behind the event. The Lost Screen Memorial had been developed in partnership with the Five Rights Foundation and was deliberately timed to coincide with the World Health Assembly Week in Geneva, the same assembly Sophie would address 2 days later. Both women chose the same week. Only one chose it because that is where decisions are actually made. There was one detail the cameras didn't really dwell on. The crowd looked small in the photos that circulated. Meghan's team pointed to security limits on public access, while critics weren't convinced. It mattered because the whole point of her Geneva appearance was to reach. The speech landed, and the cause behind it is not in question, but global messaging still lives or dies on who is actually in the room. Online, the images were already circulating before Sophie even arrived, and they told a different story from the press coverage. The mayor of Geneva offered polite thanks. Then things moved on. 2 days later, Sophie arrived in the same city. She was there in her official capacity as global ambassador for the International Agency for the Prevention of Blindness, speaking to health ministers, diplomats, and international health leaders at the 79th World Health Assembly. She said more than 1 billion people worldwide are living with preventable or treatable vision loss, not because the solutions don't exist, but because sustained, prioritized action has never followed. She laid out the financial case, too. Every dollar invested in eye health in low- and middle-income countries is estimated to return about $28 in economic gains. Then, she looked out at the room of government officials and said they should not wait until November. They needed to start shaping commitments now, she said, because the know-how was already there. There was no flourish or polished line for social media, just direct instruction to a room full of health ministers that was actually listening. Afterwards, she met privately with the Director General of the World Health Organization, the same man who, 48 hours earlier, had presented Meghan with an official WHO field vest as a gesture of recognition. Both women stood before the same global audience in the same city within the same week. Meghan arrived with a camera crew and a cause she had built herself. Sophie arrived with an official brief, a private meeting with the most powerful figure in global health, and a title that carries 700 years of weight. The room noticed the difference, because the Geneva week didn't come out of nowhere. It traces back to something that happened years earlier, something one of the women never moved past. What exactly did Sophie offer? And why does the fact that Meghan never called back matter more than anything that came after? She left the door open. When Sophie married Prince Edward in June 1999, nobody was handing her a manual. She was walking into an institution that had broken people before her, and she had no one who had done it the way she was about to do it to learn from. It was no wonder she made mistakes early on. In the spring of 2001, less than 2 years into her marriage, Sophie was caught up in an undercover operation run by a journalist for the now-defunct News of the World, who posed as an Arab businessman interested in hiring her public relations firm. The journalist recorded their meetings without her knowledge. What came out of those recordings, including remarks she made about senior royals and then Prime Minister Tony Blair, triggered a national scandal. Some politicians called for a formal review of the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth was reported to be deeply upset, and the palace spent weeks in damage control. Sophie stepped down from her PR company and released a public statement acknowledging a serious misjudgment. In any other world, that could have been the end of her. What is less often reported is that Queen Elizabeth did not distance herself from Sophie. She brought her closer. The Queen and Prince Philip invited Sophie and Edward to Sandringham shortly after the scandal broke. Those close to the palace at the time described it as a signal that she was not being cut loose. That decision shaped everything that followed. Sophie's rehabilitation was not self-made. It was granted specifically by the one person whose opinion of her mattered most. So she stopped running from the institution and committed to it completely. It took years of discipline that most people would never sustain under that level of scrutiny. But Sophie rebuilt herself. She became a full-time working royal. She took on causes few others wanted: conflict zones, sight loss, and sexual violence in war. She traveled to places most royals would rarely go. Over time, she earned back Queen Elizabeth's trust to the point that those close to the palace described their relationship as rare. So when younger women began marrying into the royal family, Sophie understood something nobody else in that institution could offer them from personal experience. She knew what it felt like to get it wrong, and she understood the cost. She was willing to share what she had learned. When Kate Middleton arrived, Sophie extended her hand, and Kate took it. Years later, when Meghan arrived, she did the same. She reached out. The Sun and several royal correspondents reported that the two women met multiple times and spent hours in conversation, accounts that the palace did not contradict. Sophie described Meghan as warm, curious, and engaging. She opened every door she had. She told Meghan she could call her at any time, about anything, including the more difficult personalities within the family. This was not a polite offer made for appearances. It came from the woman Queen Elizabeth trusted more than almost anyone else in the family, giving a new arrival a direct line to how to navigate the institution. And after those meetings, Meghan never called. No return invitation followed, and Sophie's home in Surrey was less than 30 minutes from Frogmore Cottage, where Meghan and Prince Harry had just moved. A source close to Sophie, speaking to The Sun, noted carefully and diplomatically that it would have been nice to receive an invitation in return. But the question that matters is what happened to those two women next. The contrasting responses. The relationship between Sophie and Kate Middleton did not begin as a friendship. It began as a mentorship, one Sophie had earned the hard way. At Princess Eugenie's wedding, a gust of wind lifted Kate's skirt, and for a moment it looked as though she was about to have a Marilyn Monroe-style mishap. Before the photographers could make anything of it, Sophie stepped in front of her and blocked the view. Then there was Remembrance Sunday, in 2024. Kate had spent most of the year out of public view, dealing privately with a cancer diagnosis that shocked the country when it became public. Her return to official duties was being watched by millions around the world. As the service ended and she and Sophie walked back from the balcony of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, Sophie reached over and placed a hand on Kate's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it landed. Royal commentator Ingrid Seward said afterward, it was the sort of thing she would not have expected to see even a few years earlier. Royal author Robert Jobson put it simply that the moment spoke for itself. That hand on the shoulder was not a public relations gesture. Sophie had been part of Kate's support system throughout her treatment during the months that never made the news. By the time Kate returned to public life, their relationship had become more than a friendship. Meanwhile, the documentary Royal Peacemaker, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, which aired in May 2026, put both stories side by side. Royal commentator Emily Andrews recalled that Sophie had extended the same offer to Meghan that she had once given Kate, and then waited. According to Andrews, Sophie was surprised when she did not hear back. She did not lash out or try to settle scores. She simply carried on with the work she had always done and let the two stories unfold on their own. By 2026, they had been running side by side long enough that the gap between them was hard to miss. But before the documentary brought that contrast to a wider audience, something else happened. Something more immediate, more public, and far harder to take back. In March 2021, Harry and Meghan sat down with Oprah Winfrey and said things no senior royal had ever said on camera. And Sophie's response was either the most tone-deaf thing a royal said that year or the most calculated, depending entirely on who you ask. Oprah, who? The interview ran for 2 hours. It included allegations of racism inside the institution, claims that Meghan had been denied mental health support when she was in crisis, and accusations of coldness, isolation, and deliberate cruelty. The palace issued a formal response. It had not done anything at that level, not like that, in a generation. What made the timing matter was that Sophie gave that interview knowing exactly what the palace needed from her. The Sussex interview had left a vacuum. Someone inside the family had to signal, publicly and without ambiguity, that the institution was not in crisis. Sophie stepped into that space and closed it in 8 words. Weeks after the interview aired, Sophie and Prince Edward sat down for their own conversation with the Daily Telegraph, their first joint interview since their wedding in 1999. When the interviewer asked about the Oprah interview, Edward replied, "Oprah? Who?" Sophie laughed and added, "What interview?" 8 words in one of the most watched media moments of that year. And they were not an accident. Sophie had spent 15 years in professional communications before she ever took a royal brief. She didn't just learn how words land. She knew exactly what the effect would be before she said them. The 2001 tabloid scandal had taught her, at high personal cost, that every word spoken to any journalist in any context could be the word that defines you. Oprah, who, was not careless. It was calculated. It was directed at a specific audience: the British tabloids, the palace establishment, and the broader royal watching community who needed to see, clearly and without ambiguity, that the institution was not treating the Sussex interview as a legitimate crisis to be managed, but as a piece of content to be dismissed. Omid Scobie, who has documented his relationship with Harry and Meghan through several books and years of royal commentary, called out the exchange in his 2023 book Endgame. He wrote that the comments made Sophie and Edward come across as either stuffy or tone-deaf, and at worst, casually bigoted. That description tied Sophie's name to something far more damaging than a passing remark, and it wasn't going to disappear. A year later, Scobie put Sophie's name next to the word bigoted in print this time. She read it, then went back to work. That wasn't passivity. For someone who had once learned the hard way what saying the wrong thing to the wrong journalist can cost, silence was a choice. The work she returned to had been growing steadily for years. While Scobie's book made headlines, Sophie was quietly completing more official engagements than almost anyone else in the family. She was carrying diplomatic briefings to foreign governments and taking on patronages that once belonged to Prince Philip. The institution wasn't just accepting her anymore, it was relying on her, which made the accusation not only sharp, but badly timed in a way people close to Sophie struggled to ignore. So what did Sophie do with that accusation? And how did the royal family respond? Called a racist in print. To understand why that word mattered, you have to look at the scale of what Sophie had built and what it now put at risk. By the end of 2024, her workload had more than doubled compared to the same period the year before, rising from 18 official engagements in one September to 37 in the next. She completed over 100 royal engagements that year and was ranked the 5th hardest working royal in an independent analysis. She had also become King Charles's main diplomatic operator, the person the institution turned to when the work required both discretion and weight. In 2023, in a visit widely reported at the time, she traveled to the Democratic Republic of Congo, carrying a direct message from King Charles, not as a ceremonial trip, but as an official diplomatic mission. She also took on the presidency of the ICVY, a global coalition on gender-based violence, a role confirmed by the organization that put her in direct contact with heads of state and UN bodies. In January 2024, the United Nations formally recognized Sophie's work with survivors of sexual violence in conflict, naming her a global champion and advocate for the UN Trust Fund to end violence against women. It wasn't the kind of role given for occasional appearances. It came from years of fieldwork in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and Bosnia, and from long-standing trust built with the organizations working there. Royal expert Katie Nicholl described her as a vital cog in the royal machine, someone who wasn't just supporting the monarchy anymore, but actively holding it together at a time when King Charles was undergoing cancer treatment, and the future of the institution was shifting around them. The word people around Sophie used when Endgame landed was not disappointed. The word was furious. Scobie alleged that Sophie had given Meghan the cold shoulder at the Queen's state funeral in September 2022, one of the most watched royal events in a decade. He then suggested Kate and Queen Camilla had done the same. The footage from that day does not clearly support that claim. The accusation landed in print, with Sophie's name attached to it, and every major outlet picked it up. Sophie's team denied it categorically. Friends stated it was blatantly untrue and pointed out that Sophie had gone out of her way to befriend Meghan in the early period of her marriage, that she had invited Meghan to tea at her Surrey home, had spent hours in conversation with her, and had offered an open door that was never walked back through. But denials rarely travel as far as the original accusation. The book was on the shelves. The name was in the sentence, and Sophie said nothing. She did not defend herself in the way that most public figures would reach for when facing that kind of accusation in a widely read book. She went back to work. And the work by that point had just come with a new title, one that said more about where Sophie stood than any statement ever could. One word said everything. In March 2023, King Charles granted his youngest brother, Prince Edward, the title of Duke of Edinburgh, a title closely tied to the modern history of the monarchy, and previously held by Prince Philip for more than 7 decades. It had been expected that the title would eventually return to the crown after Philip's death, in line with his wishes, before being reassigned. The decision came after a period of transition following Queen Elizabeth II's death in 2022, when royal roles and responsibilities were being reshaped under King Charles's new reign. The Duke of Edinburgh title itself carries long-standing public duties and associations with national and Commonwealth patronage work, rather than being purely ceremonial. When Edward received the title, Sophie automatically became the Duchess of Edinburgh, taking on the female equivalent of one of the most recognizable ducal titles in the British monarchy. She told the Mirror during a visit to Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2025, marking the 30th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide, that the moment felt significant to her. Not for the prestige, though that was part of it, but for the connection it carried. The title of Duchess of Edinburgh was the style Queen Elizabeth used from the moment she married Prince Philip in 1947 until she became Queen in 1952. For Sophie, who had spent years among the closest people to the late Queen outside the immediate family, taking on that title carried a weight that went beyond ceremony. What she did not say publicly, but what a friend later told reporters covering the story, was that the change in title also quietly removed a protocol obligation that had been sitting with her for some time. She no longer had to curtsy to Meghan Markle. Under royal protocol, a woman's place in the curtsy order is determined by her husband's rank. When Meghan married Harry, she became the wife of a prince, which placed her above Sophie, whose husband Edward was then the Earl of Wessex. In any formal setting where they appeared together, Sophie was required to dip her head to a woman who had never returned her call. Someone close to Sophie described her reaction to the title change to a royal correspondent. She said she felt relieved, not proud or vindicated, which says a lot about what that moment had come to mean for her. She had offered help and been ignored. She had been described in print in damaging terms, and now, officially, she no longer had to curtsy to the woman at the center of it all. And then a reporter put it to her directly that she and Edward were simply stepping up to fill the gap left by Harry and Meghan. Sophie looked at them and asked quietly what people thought she had been doing all along. It was a simple line, but it cut through the idea that the working royals had been scrambling to replace a missing pair. The suggestion was that there had been no gap in the first place. They had been there the whole time, carrying out the engagements, the visits, and the official duties without the attention, the interviews, or the media deals that followed Harry and Meghan's departure. The world had been watching the noise. Nobody had been watching the work. She even made a joke about it. In a 2025 interview, she told a journalist it was all very well being a secret weapon, but if no one knew, then maybe it was too secret. By May 2026, with a documentary set to air on Channel 5 and a trip to Geneva on her calendar, the secret was no longer much of a secret. On May 16, 2026, Channel 5 aired a documentary about Sophie. It never once mentioned Meghan by name. It didn't need to. The documentary that said everything, Royal Peacemaker Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, aired on Channel 5 on the evening of Saturday, May 16, 2026. It was presented as a profile, a celebration, but the way it was structured and the stories it placed next to each other made it feel less like a tribute and more like a quiet comparison. The documentary traced Sophie's full arc from the tabloid sting of 2001 that nearly cost her everything, through years of quiet rebuilding, to the point where former press secretary Elsa Anderson could sit on camera and describe the late Queen's view of her as a safe pair of hands, a true confidant in a royal world where those are exceptionally rare. Royal correspondent Victoria Murphy described Sophie as a natural mentor for Kate and pointed to specific moments as evidence. The dress catch at Eugenie's wedding, the hand on Kate's shoulder at Remembrance Sunday 2024, as Kate made one of her first appearances after completing chemotherapy. Murphy called that last gesture a sisterly act, a small but visible sign of the relationship the two women had built over the years. Then the documentary turned to the woman who said no. Emily Andrews recalled that Sophie had tried to build a relationship with Meghan from the start. She met with her, offered guidance, and made it clear her door was always open. So when the invitations stopped, and she was never invited back to Frogmore Cottage, Sophie was reportedly left wondering what had changed. The documentary did not spell it out. It simply placed the two stories side by side and left the audience to make sense of it. Sean Smith's 2025 biography, Sophie, Saving the Royal Family, which came out before the documentary, worked in much the same way. Even the title, Saving the Royal Family, made its argument clear. This is what staying looks like, and it matters because others chose not to. And then, before the documentary had even finished moving through the news cycle, Sophie was on a plane to Geneva. She arrived 2 days after Meghan had left the same city. She came with a brief and left, having delivered it. She spoke to health ministers and diplomats as the official representative of a monarchy, carrying a title with 7 centuries of history behind it and a responsibility tied to a cause affecting more than 1 billion people. There was no reference, direct or indirect, to the woman who had been in that city just 48 hours earlier. Sophie had already said what she needed to say years before, through the work, through the title, through the documentary, and through the curtsy she no longer had to make. Royal commentators noted the timing in Geneva was almost too precise to be accidental. No statement was necessary. The contrast was the communication. In May 2026, every second of it landed. Was Sophie offering Meghan hard-won wisdom, or asking her to become the very thing Meghan had decided she couldn't be? Does any of this prove Sophie's way was better? Or does it simply prove that institutions reward the people who never make them uncomfortable? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.